My name is Matthew Wertwood, and I'm a parent and university educator interested in human creativity and its relationship inside the teaching and learning environment. We often talk about creativity as the production of new and useful outcomes as they relate to a social context. So when it comes to teacher creativity, I am focused on how we interact with challenges that exist inside the classroom. When I work with educators, I often refer to this space as a box that contains constraints like a rigid curriculum, a set schedule, and a set group of students. But it also contains opportunities for professional growth and innovation. But during the global pandemic, that box changed drastically. As I observed my boys interact with the various learning activities from a distance, I became more and more fascinated with how their teachers were responding to this situation. And I started to perceive the pandemic as an event that showcased the tremendous creativity of the teaching profession. So as we approached the third anniversary, I assembled a small group of K-12 Connecticut educators to discuss their experience responding to the first lockdown, which came about so quickly in February 2020. First of all, I'd like to go around and introduce everyone. Marlon, during the pandemic, you were a 7th grade ELA teacher. Bill, during the pandemic, you were a high school computer science and technology teacher. Andrea, during the pandemic, you were a world languages teacher. Lisa, during the pandemic, you were a 4th grade teacher. Leanne, during the pandemic, you were a 1st grade teacher. And Tamashi, during the pandemic, you were a pre-service teacher, your first time in a classroom environment during the pandemic. So I'm sure we'll get into that experience a little bit. So on February 24th, there were a few key communications that I got. The first was to alert me of an upcoming multicultural festival or assembly at my boys' school. The other was seeking volunteers for the track program that was coming that spring. And then also letting me know that there would be celebration of Mardi Gras. And so the kids will be having pancakes and a whole bunch of other goodies then souped up on sugar, right? That they're going to be coming home with. Now, a week later, on March 2nd, or March 3rd rather, there's the first kind of communication coming from the superintendent's office. And that communication is obviously working to address some of the concerns that now exist for parents and the education community around the pandemic. And what it's kind of primarily putting in place is procedures for people who have been abroad, they've been traveling. But there's not really a reference that there might be school closures. About a week later, on March 10th, there is an uptick in communications. And on March 10th, we start seeing the possibility of school closures and hearing about the preparations that are taking place. And then on March 13th, or rather on March 12th, my boys' school closes. And on March 15th, the governor closes all schools until at least March 31st. So Leanne, you and I have had an opportunity to talk about this before we sat down today. So I wanted to kind of start off with you. What was it like during that first week, given how quickly things moved along?
Yeah, our principal had actually told us to start preparing packets. I work in a pre-K to 8th grade school, and they said, start preparing some packets because we'll probably be out of school for about 2 weeks. And they were talking about a little bit of what kind of platform could you use if you were home? For example, Seesaw, Google Classroom, those types of things. So we all went to the copiers and we were making packets. That Thursday, we found out in the morning that we were closing for 2 weeks. So we sent home packets with all the kids. We had Friday off. They just said we weren't going to work at all on Friday. And we just didn't know what was going to happen. That weekend, we got communication that we were to be on Zoom on Monday with our classes.
And what was that first Monday and Tuesday like during working on Zoom?
It's terrifying. I had never even heard of Zoom. So I had my home computer, my own personal old computer at home. My husband, who is very tech savvy, helped me install Zoom and kind of get that link out, which was all a learning curve for me. I was supposed to be on Zoom around 9:30 in the morning. I got my computer all ready, geared up, crashed. My entire computer crashed at 9:30 in the morning. And it was a disaster. I don't think I even got on that day.
We got an email in the morning. Take everything home. Students, empty your lockers. Teachers tell all the kids, everything goes home today. We'll be out for a week, whatever. Our district was just the opposite. No one was to go onto Zoom or Google Meets or anything because they hadn't vetted it with the town attorneys. I was on at 7 a.m. the next Monday morning. My kids, they weren't part of that communication train you read. That went to parents, that went to teachers. Kids were left out of that in a large respect, and they didn't know what to expect.
You're also referencing the fact that that week wasn't about going back and teaching.
No.
It was about providing support to your students.
So SEL, it's been there forever, but it was never a forefront topic, became the only topic for the first 2 weeks when school went out. It was all about, how do we engage and how do we deal with that social emotional piece? And how do we teach our kids to deal with something different? You said you put the classroom in a box. The box didn't change, the box disappeared.
So where I was working in 7th grade ELA, the teachers all got together at the different subject areas, and we had to send home packets or practice work. For ELA, it was independent reading and some other writing practice. But for that first week, we were supposed to be giving them independent work to do at home. And we didn't do anything. The teachers were just at home waiting to hear what was going to happen next. And then at the end of that week, we were told everything would be asynchronous. We would be posting work on a Monday, weekly work in Google Docs with links to the lessons, to the assignments. And we had to have that all up and running and ready to go Monday morning by 8 a.m. And then we would collect work as it came in through Google Classroom. I think right around April break time, we were told we had to offer office hours. And so we had to set our times, and it could be whatever time we wanted in the morning. And we would set up our meets, and then the students would come in. And I think it was about the same 6 people every day that I talked to. And it was never really about the work. It was, I met all of their pets and their siblings. And they showed me their backyards, and I can do a cartwheel, and look at this. This is where I go for my walk. And it was just the emotional support and the connection.
My middle son has this video game. I've forgotten what it's called. It's an iPad game. You have 60 seconds to go and grab things from the house before you end up in a bunker. And it's about surviving the bunker. It's like, it's an apocalypse type situation. You've got 1 minute. Do you grab the water? Do you grab the first aid kit? And it sounds like everyone experienced this situation where it's like, you've got this half a day to go and grab everything, but you kind of don't know what you need in order to teach under these conditions. Number one, it sounds like no one kind of knows whether or not they're going to get back in the building. Like, what were some of the things that allowed you to start beginning to teach again under these new conditions?
It became clear that I had to have 2 computers up. So when I'm not even tech savvy with one, now I had 2, because if I was presenting my screen or what was on the document camera, I couldn't see what 29 first graders were doing. So I had to have a separate screen just to see all the boxes of children's faces, and then have my screen so that I could see what I was presenting. And that was different. Then it was, how do I teach without them seeing me if I'm showing the document or the presentation. So that was a whole new way to start thinking about, I have to teach regrouping and subtraction to first graders. How am I going to do that using manipulatives? How was I going to show that? And it was just a lot of trial, a lot of error. We were scared. It just really, it bonded us in a way. That class will forever be special because we did spend a lot of time together, even though it wasn't in the box. It was in our own way.
Your kid's video game, that was my class assignment 3 days a week. All right, guys, here's the scavenger hunt list. Find what you got at home. Here's what we're trying to make at the end. Because you're going to leave the house.
If everyone watched the movie Apollo 13, there's that scene, right? Like, at the end of the day, what's on the spacecraft is what you've got.
Into the square hole.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I do in my robotics class is we talk about aviation. What do you do at home? I'm like, guys, we're making paper airplanes today. Every one of you, get your camera ready. Follow yourself around the room. Who can make the paper airplane fly through 5 different rooms today? I had people who went out on their roofs and were throwing them for 30 feet off their house and going, look, I made it to the neighbor's house. How does that count? And, just the creativity from the kids of, okay, here's a website that shows you how to make 400 different paper airplanes. Everybody pick one.
In your class, you've referenced how you enjoy conversations, group conversations. How did that play out online? Did you have to abandon that, or did you come up with kind of solutions to do that at a distance?
So one of the things that I found was improved was my one-on-one written communication with students, and they were willing to go there with me. So we used Google Classroom, so there was a lot of back and forth commenting. I used a program called Actively Learn, which they'd given all of the teachers during the pandemic the free premium version, and it was fantastic. And it was a lot of texts in there, a lot of the texts that we used, and then you could modify the questions as the teacher, so I could take out the standards that might have been placed in there and put in the standards that we were using, and ask them questions, ask them open-ended questions, and then you could go in and have multi-layered conversations back and forth on the question level. So I felt as though, while it wasn't a verbal communication until we started the Google Meets after April break, it was very robust in writing. And I felt like I had never had conversations like that with students because, you give them something, they might write you a sentence or two on paper, put a Post-it note up, give you something back, send something in on Google Classroom, which I was using before in a limited capacity. I felt like because they had the time and I had the time, we all had the time to have this deep conversation in writing.
So this section is named Navigating COVID Protocols. And I've got some COVID protocols. I've got masks. I've got physical distancing. I've got arrival and dismissal. I've got common spaces. I've got school numbers are limiting the number of non-essential adults, lunch, snacks, playground, recess, bathrooms, busing. Safety equipment, pre-K, before and after care, cleaning and sanitizing, shared student supplies, nursing and sick students. What else? It just goes on and on. And, Andrea, I want to come to you because you said something really interesting in your survey. You kind of said, well, we went back, but in some ways it was harder than what you were dealing with at the beginning of the pandemic, because even though you did go back, you kind of didn't go back.
Yeah, it felt well. So again, I think at that time I was trying to figure out how to teach at the elementary level, which had very specific guidelines. They were operating in cohorts that they would travel like in little groups of people all around the school. And they could not interact with one another from different classes. They at like in the hallway, during recess, in the cafeteria. And then at the high school, I was dealing with like half my kids physically in while the others were at home in Zoom. But then I was teaching from my desk. I've never sat so much in my life than when we came back from teaching. Like I always remember being like, it feels really lazy for me to be on my butt over here while I'm trying to teach. It doesn't feel like I'm teaching. It felt like it felt like a disservice. It felt like, I saw them. I was just trying to reach to them to be like, I can help you with this technology. I just can't get close to you and I have to figure out how to do it.
And I just want to ask you one more question about your situation. As a world language teacher, you speak Spanish most of the time in the classroom.
Yeah.
So you're helping students navigate the technology and provide this additional support. Are you still speaking to them in Spanish?
Yes. So in world language education and for second language acquisition, they really encourage at least 90% use of the target language. So at the very least, like no matter the level. And so when we came back from the pandemic, perhaps I was stubborn, but I was thinking like, this is the time where we need to really enforce this because they've lost so much language while they've been away. So how is it that we sort of revive this practice? And so for me, to walk a student through how to use technology in the language that they know is one thing, but in a language that they don't know is a completely different challenge, right? And I was adamant that I was just going to do it in I was going to do it in Spanish, and that required for me to support them with visuals. So I created
Yeah.
extensive slides. If I anticipated a direction or some word that I knew was going to be problematic for them to understand, something that was not a cognate, right? Something that they just couldn't make sense of, I would say it out loud, and I would time my this word with a visual that was color coded with the word written out in the same color as the visual, right? So like they would hear it and they'd be like, I don't know what that means, but here comes flying in this picture of what it is that she's trying to say. And immediately after that, I would have a slide where they would annotate, like on their iPads with their fingers, because we had iPads for all students, like, did you understand this? And they would like annotate, like, I understood it. I understood a little bit of it. Can you say it again? Or I have no idea what you're saying. So like, it just helped me gauge like how much of my directions they were really able to internalize. So those became like, I remember teaching for the 4th and 5th graders, we have 25-minute classes 3 times a week. And those 25-minute classes with this sort of visual support became like 30 to 50 slides per 25-minute class.
I really felt like the box had become so much more rigid when we went back to school that fall. In the spring, we might have been apart, but we were able to connect. We were all a little bit more relaxed. No one was having to follow so many rules. And it just became, for me, all about the rules and the protocols. I remember 6-minute passing periods because we had to wipe down every desk before the students left the room.
I think the structure was needed to pull things back in, but the pendulum was swung way too far to the other side, where there was a concern that if we don't do this right, we're going to have to close again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And who's going to get blamed for that when it happens?
It was
Yeah.
stressful. It was stressful, not just teaching in that kind of environment, but you were worried about the health. Like, gosh forbid you were the one that, spread a COVID to somebody or your class went out. And it was the constant cleaning. I think in that email was sent home, you had to teach your 1st grade and kindergartners how to open everything.
Yeah.
Because I shouldn't have to come to your desk and open your jar.
Yeah.
That was how, at the beginning, that's how it was. Could we pass papers out to each other? When kids passed papers in, we were letting them sit for 20 minutes, or 2 days, 24 hours before I touched them to correct them. And we were talking about language, and I was thinking about you teaching language. We had masks. How was I supposed to teach phonics and reading with these masks on? So again, it was going back to videos. It was using, I believe it was a series of speech teachers who were teaching kids how to make sounds. The TH is a, I couldn't show that with my mask. Or an F is a, they're different things that we teach in 1st grade that now I had to find different ways to show that, because they couldn't understand if I was saying fun or them. They couldn't hear that difference for a spelling test. It was,
There's a lot of fear.
yeah.
For me, there was a lot of fear. And am I going to be the class that shuts down? There was a lot of fear for the students that when the phone rang, we're done, we're closing. And fear as a parent, am I going to bring something home to my family too? So we were very rigid. We had to follow those protocols because we were so scared. And then it goes back to your point about the teaching practices. Like, we know what good teaching practices are, and we weren't able to do that. And that was really difficult. And we had to find different ways to teach. And it may not have been good teaching practices. And that's what's hard for us as educators, because we want to do our best and do well. But there were so many levels to every day walking into that building. You're so happy to be back in person and be with your class and your colleagues who you relied on for so much, but then you were so scared because what's going to happen today? Like, it was really unpredictable too, and uncertain. But you still had to go forward with your day, and you had to show up every day with a smile on your face and not show fear and not show uncertainty and say, we're okay. Everything's good. We got this. Don't worry. And, it is good because we taught our students that mentality. Like, we're going to be okay. We can get through this. But it was not okay. For me, at least internally, I had a lot of stress, a lot of fear, a lot of turmoil during that time of being, back in person with mass. And being a good teacher.
We've got to bring you in here because, this is your first time in a classroom environment. I mean, tell us some of your stories. What does that look like?
Yes. And then you talked about some of the communications from the schools about safety, what we're doing. And so part of that, you mentioned like non-essential adults. So unfortunately, as a student teacher, I qualified as a non-essential adult. And so I think it was maybe August when that was like settled that I would not be going in person for that fall semester. And so the way my student teaching was set up for the fall semester, you go in once a week to observe, get to know the students, so that in the spring when you're teaching, you're already part of the class. So right off the bat, already not part of the class. So I was living off campus. I was living in my apartment. And my school was hybrid. I was at the same school as Andrea. So half of my students were at home and half of my students were in person. And so what me and my cooperating teacher ended up doing is we decided that everyone was going to be on the Zoom, whether you were in person, whether you're at home. So I was on the Zoom from my apartment. My students were on the Zoom from the classroom. The other half of the students were on the Zoom from their house. So I had one screen with my students on the Zoom, one screen of the screen that I was sharing with my students. And then I had my iPad in front of me where I would be writing to like simulate a whiteboard for them, explain whatever chemistry thing we were explaining. My cooperative teacher was great. So he would be in person. He would set up the labs for them. I would do the instructions. My students who were in person would like set up their camera so that at home people could see them do the lab. That's great. Then I would like hop in the breakout rooms from my apartment saying, "Hey, how's the lab going?" And they would be doing the things. And me and my students had or at least I had acknowledged that I know this is a tough situation. My students who are in school aren't even getting their in-person teacher because I was at home because they have the student teacher. So I decided to start celebrating Friday in my classroom. And so every Friday, I would send out this Google form on my classroom. And it would be like, one would be like, how's your week going? And it would be a series of memes. And then it would be like, what's your favorite song? Or what's your favorite show? Or do you like artificial banana flavoring? Like the most randomest questions. And I would send that out on Friday. And I told them, if you do it, you can check a box at the end. And if you want me to reply, I'll reply like to all your answers. So every week we started doing that. And it was the sweetest thing ever because my students would go off on these forums and tell me about like their boyfriend. They'd tell me about like how everything's crazy, or they'd tell me just about how their sister is being annoying this week.
I do have to bring this up because it's not just your story, but I think you did a really good job of kind of talking about all of the different solutions you developed to the problems that you had to face as a new teacher. But if you listen to all of the stories that you've just been sharing, going back to this box concept, within that box, there are problems that we can't address. There are constraints as well. And if you listen to your stories, you're identifying the constraints. You're having to work with the constraints and develop solutions. And so you're there recognizing the importance of developing a relationship, which we've all identified as an important part of teaching. And you're coming up with these strategies on how you could do that. And this is the type of creativity that I thought, at least from that parent perspective, that I was seeing emerge weekly. It seemed that you as the teaching community kept getting better at engaging students from a distance.
I think they got better going back in the fall of 2020 because I'm a tech integrator. On top of everything else, I was trying to teach teachers how to connect with their students through the tech when we got sent home. And for me, when I was teaching teachers, I'm like, oh, hang on, I'm changing to this screen. And they're like, what do you mean this screen? Most teachers had no concept. It was one computer, one screen in their classroom. So when we initially went home, that was a really hard thing to deal with. And I'm like, okay, do you have a second laptop? Well, yeah, it's not very good. Great. Plug it in, join your Google Meet. Well, why would I do that? Well, that one you're going to see your kids on. Mm-hmm. This one you're going to present on. And that aha moment a lot came across when you're talking with teachers. Now, when we got back to school, teachers were starting to figure it out. And even though we were still hybrid and even though we still needed things, now IT was, hey, I need a machine that can have 3 screens on it in my classroom, or I need a second Chromebook that I can have at the other end of the room so that when I'm teaching, I can watch from this side and see my kids when I'm on this side of the room. Even though my main computer is 10 feet away and I can't see anything on that screen, I need something else I can see with it. So there was definitely a technology change. And I would say even the most technology scared teachers became much more tech savvy.
But we had a lot who helped each other.
Absolutely.
Teachers really, not only did we realize the relationships with our students were so important, but the relationships with each other was so important. And, we did have teachers that had been in the building for, 30 plus years who didn't use the computer besides sending emails home. That, was basically there. And now all of a sudden they had 5 students who had chosen to be distant and now had to film everything all day long. And it was a collective help of how to get it running, how to get it up, how to help people learn about this new technology. And I think that we really realize that important of mentorship and help and sharing what was working and what wasn't working in the classroom.
All right, so I want to kind of bring our discussion to a close now. And as part of that closure, what I'd like you to do is to think a little bit about some of the solutions that you've developed that are still in place today. And then also how the experience has perhaps changed how you view your teacher agency within your classroom environment. So, you had referenced that you still use one of your solutions today. Could you kind of tell us a little bit more about that?
During the pandemic, I had my students do that Google form. It was called, I think, like literally just about me. And so now in my classroom, we do what we call a journal moment. So every Friday, I'll put a prompt on the board. My students will journal, and then they can put it in like this bin that's Miss Atiarchi responds. So a lot of my students have me just respond to like the most randomest things once again. And it's a really sweet way for me to connect with them, to some of my students who don't really talk that much in class. Sometimes I'll be like, I didn't write anything, miss, but can you just write something back to me? And it's the sweetest thing. So I do that. We used to make these study videos to help for the tests. I still just make those and just post them. And so that's not something I don't think I would have done. But with Zoom, like being able to have the study guide here and I can talk and write on it, it was great. So I still use that. And a lot of just like the flexibility that came with the pandemic, I try to still bring into my classroom, because I think sometimes as teachers, we forget our students have a whole life outside of our classroom and we don't account for that. And I really try to bring a lot of that I did exercise in the pandemic, like still to this day, and try to.
I think Andrea said something before about you constantly had to anticipate a problem, what was going to happen. And I think that with the pandemic, I'm better at that. I'm better at thinking about a lesson, thinking about what is going to be difficult for them, and coming up with those solutions, whether it's going to be adding a video or the step-by-step teaching that I had to do, where are they going to have difficulty with it. I think that back then, every night I was working on the computer to create the next day's slides or activity, and to really think about them at home and what were they going to have, because I wasn't within that reach of them. To me, that physical reach was so important and I couldn't do it. And for that, I think I'm a better teacher.
For my situation, my students were the main source of inspiration and motivation, and the ones that helped me problem solve. I think that if anything, what I heard across the board from administrators or just people that were, sitting in an office telling us, mandating things for us to do, over and over, we would just hear like, we don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. We hear that these are issues, but we don't have the answers. So then I remember being like, okay, we just had an hour meeting where we were just given a space to say everything that's wrong, and then told that we have no way to help you figure this out. So I leaned on my students to help me problem solve, right? In terms of like, how is it that we're anticipating issues? How is it that we are differentiation, like what that even means? Like, we are redefining student success. We are redefining what it means for students to be engaged, right? And where I went to have more clarity was to my students. They helped me because they're the ones that tell you like, this could have been a really, really pretty presentation that you did, but it did nothing for me, right? And even though somebody else might have vetted it, somebody else, whoever was doing PD was saying that this is the latest and the best, your students were coming at you saying like, no, it's not cutting it for me. And so for me, like being able to problem solve with all these hurdles meant that I had to be intentional about creating a space where my students felt that they could share how they were experiencing like learning.
Big takeaway from this as well is what all of you were saying is that teachers are incredible problem solvers. Is that we were thrown into a problem that no one else had been thrown into before, and we solved it in multiple ways and were successful. To whatever measure you want to measure your success. But I would say that every single one of us and every single teacher was successful in some way. So that the problem solving, I think, for me is at the forefront, where now I look at problems differently in my classroom. And I don't look at them as like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. It's more like, okay, now how can I do it? And what avenue can I go? And who can I tap into to help? Like our colleagues that you had mentioned, Leanne, like what colleagues can I lean on to help me build that problem and solving it? So teachers are incredible problem solvers. No matter what the problem is, we solve it.
As I concluded our discussion, I realized that the creativity I observed from teachers during the pandemic wasn't just about student engagement and coming up with new ways to use a technology. It was an increase in flexibility and an acceptance for ambiguity and a heightened connection to student needs and wants. Problem solving has always been a big part of everyday teaching, but during the pandemic, teachers found creative agency to adopt new approaches and design new experiences. They leveraged relationships, challenged assumptions, and pursued new questions of their learning environments. This conversation provided an opportunity to reflect on this creativity, and I hope it is something that schools around the country will do, because there is a lot to learn and consider as we work to address new challenges post-pandemic, which include not only continued gaps in student learning, but the emerging disruption of generative AI. However, after making this film, I'm inspired because I feel we have what we need to continue to figure it out.